Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of Compassion and Courage Conversations in Healthcare. I'm your host, Marc, and this is the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience. You all, in this cool life that I get to live, I get to go around the country and not only get to share my story and my experiences and expertise with audiences, but I get to hear a lot of other really great people share their information with healthcare audiences. And today I get to share my new friend, Mike Cummings, with you. Mike, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being with me.
Oh, it's great to be with you, Marcus.
So we met a few months ago at Nebraska Hospital Association, right?
Correct. I think it was their quality assurance meeting.
Yeah. And I was so intrigued by your presentation because the work that I do is all about compassion, right? It's all about compassion and communication and empathy, and how do we do that as those who are in healthcare? And we typically think of that as the most typical scenario is the bedside nurse or the doctor that's providing that compassionate care for the patient at the other end of the stethoscope. But I was so intrigued by your presentation because, like me, you have zero clinical expertise. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct, Marcus.
So how did you get started in this world that took you into hospital security that again, we don't usually think of security as something that contains a lot of compassion, but after listening to your presentation, there were so many takeaways that I wanted to share with the CNC audience. So can you kind of take us back to the beginning? How did you get involved in security, and how did you specifically get involved in hospital and healthcare security?
Okay, so I just celebrated my 49th year, so I'll try to do the Cliff Notes version of this, Marcus. I started when I was in senior year of college in retail security, where I spent the first 12 and a half years of my career. And then a colleague of mine was getting permission to add an assistant director in a healthcare environment, which I knew nothing about, healthcare. But I did know basic security, and so I joined hospital security. And as the assistant director, and then briefly, 2 years later, he left, and I was fortunate enough to become the director. Shortly thereafter, we merged with two other hospitals, and after 6 months or so, I became fortunate enough again to become the director of the combined organization. My big takeaway and the partial reason for leaving retail was that it wasn't as fulfilling as healthcare was. I spent 32 years with the organization, and one of the biggest differences was that in security or loss prevention, we'll talk a little bit about both of those aspects I believe. In retail, and this isn't a slight against retail, but it was predominantly based on protecting the assets of the merchandise and the cash and those sorts of things, where when I got into hospital security, the focus was really about the patient, the visitor, and certainly our staff. And that became so personally rewarding for me to practice my craft in an environment that was directly impacting people like yourself who are there for any small to great lengths of time, that I stayed my entire career there and continued to do so in a consulting capacity at this point.
And that's the expertise that you were sharing with the Nebraska Hospital Association when we met. And one of the things that I really took away is some words that you just used there. You talked about loss prevention, and you drew a parallel, I suppose, to why would we use that language versus calling ourselves hospital security, right? In the healthcare environment. And I thought that was such a great point about using this language that has less to do with a challenge and more to do with kind of inclusivity, right?
Yes, exactly. In my first 2 years before I was fortunate enough to ascend to the top position, the leadership position, I learned a lot about myself. I learned a lot about, I stopped looking at my role as security is protecting stuff and really protecting people. And a big part of that was understanding people and listening to people. And many of the things that I heard you speak at that same conference about, and I read in your book about compassionate communication. And so when I took over, I wanted to send a message, Marcus. I wanted to send a message to my colleagues in the hospital, to the patients and visitors we serve, and equally important to my own staff, that we're not and so what I did was I changed the name. I got permission to change the name of the department from whatever it was, security services or something, but to loss prevention services. And our three service lines that were assigned to me were security, the typical security, parking, which we always seem to inherit, and then a large role in a multitask safety program for our organization. And so I wanted to move a mindset. We had a lot of young officers that came in that wanted to be police officers eventually, and that's great. We need good police officers. But I tried to send a message to my staff that we're not police. We're not an enforcement department. We're a service department, and everything we do should support our mission, vision, values, and provide service, or we shouldn't be doing it. And so that was a symbolic way of starting it, and then the rest of it came about through our policies and our training and our reinforcement of those concepts.
Those concepts are incredibly important in this compassionate ecosystem that we talk about. And I was intrigued to learn, because whenever I think of hospital security or loss prevention, as you would talk about, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I think to the minds of a lot of lay folks like myself who don't work every day in a hospital or healthcare environment, is the patient that might be brought in that's belligerent in the emergency room, or the family member who is kind of going crazy while they're because they want to make sure that their family member is getting the right treatment. And you introduced me to a whole bunch of other things that loss prevention and security personnel do within healthcare systems. Can you share a little bit of that for those of us who don't work in that environment every day?
Yes, and I think what it really came down to, Marcus, is whatever we do, whatever services we provide. So we had a long list of services, all to help make the experience for the patient, to the small degree that we could versus the large degree that a doctor and a nurse does, a positive and supportive experience. You know, you hit the nail on the head when you talk about, and one of the biggest things I learned is people go shopping. From my past experience, they go shopping. It's a fun thing. Most people want to be shopping, and it's a great experience for them. Hardly anybody, unless they're having a baby, wants to be in the hospital, nor do they want to have to be in the hospital because a loved one is there. So automatically we need to understand, all caregivers, and we called all staff in our hospital caregivers, they need to understand that it's automatically defaults to a stressful environment for the reasons that you just mentioned. And so when we go into deal with somebody, whether it's just something as simple as handling their patient valuables and keeping them protected while they're a patient so they don't lose something or have a bad experience, or whether we're assisting with wayfinding, or whether we're doing an investigation because something happened negatively to their vehicle while it was parked here. It's all about what I read in, like, the takeaways in most of the chapters of your book would resonate with a security person, and that is to make sure we're listening, that we're it's not so much about what we do, and I think that came out loud and clear in your book, but it was about how we do it. Do we acknowledge them as people and not as a diagnosis? Do we ask them questions? Do we gain permission to enter their room? Do we provide them with our name? Do we ask if there's anything else we can do? Do we let them know how they can reach us if they need anything else? It's all of those. It's all that mindset that supports us doing good security and making it a safe environment for everybody, but doing it in such a way, as you certainly lived during your experiences, that understood it with empathy and listening what the patient and the visitor needed, and how we can search out for win-wins in those circumstances.
Win-win. I always say a win-win situation isn't good enough. We need a win-win-win-win situation in healthcare where everybody walks away feeling supported and cared for. And it's a trying time when loss prevention or security needs to quote unquote be called, right? It's always a threat. I'm going to call security. And I thought that you did such a great job of showing how in situations we can use compassionate communication to not escalate. I'd love you to flesh out that idea a little bit more about, instead of de-escalation, how do we, where things have already gotten out of hand and we've got to pump the brake and bring things down, how do we not let things get escalated? That idea of non-escalation. Can you share a little bit more about how that works in a healthcare environment, and how that's not just something that that those who are in loss prevention or security are doing? It's you're helping those at the bedside learn some of those techniques too.
Absolutely, and I think, well, I'll comment about that in a little bit more depth when I answer the first part of your question. It's about, when we teach conflict management to our security staff over the years, we didn't always begin with a non-escalation. We started with, okay, you walk into a situation, a patient is amped up, let's de-escalate them, and then let's solve the problem and get the win-win or the win-win-win-win, whatever we can find out of that, and help them move forward and do so in a peaceful manner. About 5 years before I left, we changed our training a little bit on the surface, but I think dramatically, by starting the training from the standpoint of non-escalation. And that is, when we see something, we try to anticipate if somebody's having a need that we can help them with. So if we see somebody just lost in a hallway, rather than walk past them and wait for them to ask for directions, we seek out opportunities. And that's a form of non-escalation. If we see somebody pacing in the emergency department after they've been checked in by the registration nurse, but haven't been triaged yet because of the process of ranking, heart attack over a cut finger, so to speak, but that person with the cut finger, it's important to them that we teach the officers who may be in the ED, rather than just a monitor, to go up to them and say, listen, I know you've been here a while, we're really busy today. Would it help if I went and got you a cup of coffee? Would it help if I went back to see about how much longer it might be for you to be seen? And you start out with that, with a universal greeting of your name and your role and what can I do for you. That de-escalates the situation. There's been no verbal conflict yet, but when we teach our staff how to recognize that and intervene early on, we're way ahead of the game. And if you already get there and it is a little amped up, then you start from the next level, which is de-escalation. But you start with the same thing by introducing yourself, some kind of universal greeting, telling them where you're from, and asking them how you can help them, what's going on, and how can I help you, as opposed to here's what I want you to do. Mm-hmm. And I think those are some of the basic concepts of that I spoke about in Nebraska, and that obviously you picked up on.
Yeah, there were a lot of things that I took away, because again, my work is with that compassionate caregiving at the bedside, and it's an area of healthcare that is so vitally important, loss prevention and security. But I just don't have a lot of experience in that, and you, pardon the pun, but opened my eyes to a lot of the work that professionals like yourself do. And I always ask my guests to share an experience. You heard the story about how Jennifer was there for me in the emergency room, and at the beginning of each semester with my pre-meds, their first reflection of the year is kind of the same thing I ask my guests, which is to share an experience about a time someone has been there for you, or that you've been there for someone else. And I was extremely interested to hear about your professional experiences of being there and providing compassion to those whether it's patients or family members or associates of the hospital, caregivers. Is there an instance that comes to mind whenever I ask you about a time that someone was there for you or that you were there for someone?
Yes, I remember when you first asked that a while back, and I thought about it. And so I'm going to tell us a brief story that I kind of think ties some of the points that we've been talking about together. And this didn't have to do with a patient, but I could probably come up with stories. This one was with a new caregiver. As our organization grew, we assimilated, and other organizations merged in with us. And sometimes in a large company, what happens is that there are restructurings and people either lose their jobs or lose the job that they had. And shortly after the smaller organization joined us, and they didn't have a security department per se, I got a call from a supervisor at that site that said, we understand you have security. We have an employee who is being sent home because their job has been eliminated and they're being very disruptive. We don't know how to handle that. And very much like a patient who comes in or a visitor who comes in, they're upset, there's stress involved, they may not be acting the way they would normally act. And so I tried to take the same approach with that person. So I went to the site, and oftentimes it's about introducing yourself, understanding that person needs to gather their belongings and leave. They can do that, come back later and get all their personal things on their desk, those sorts of things. But they do need to leave now because she was being very disruptive and yelling and angry, and I understood all that, but we couldn't let it continue. And so a lot of times, Marcus, it's about trying to provide options for the person. So I introduced myself and said, listen, I understand Mary, or whatever her name was, that you're really upset. This is a trying time. We understand that. We're not trying to make your life miserable. We also want to let you know that we have an employee assistance program that will be open to you. If you're going through anger or emotions, or even need some financial or some other help after you're leaving, I want to know. And I gave her a card for that. And I said, so we are here for you. I said, but what I need you to do now is pack up your thing, pack up your coat and your purse, or if you feel like you're in a frame of mind to take all of your belongings, you can do that as well, and I'll wait for you. But you will have to leave. But you will have to settle down and stop the disruption and the swearing and everything that's going on, because the business needs to continue. And, do we understand? Is there anything I can do for you? And I asked those questions. And I said, how are you feeling about it? And what can we do? What would you like to do? Would you like to go completely and come back another day, or would you like to gather things now? But I had to set some limits. I said, but to do that, you have to stop this negative behavior, or I'm going to have to ask you to leave immediately. And if you refuse to do that and you continue, I may even need to call the police and have you removed. And so I gave her options, and she wasn't happy with the options, but she thought about the options, and she chose the option of, I'll just take my purse and coat and I'll leave and I'll come back another day. And on the way out, she became more disruptive again, and we had to have that same discussion about options. But she said, well, one other thing, I need to pick up my daughter's prescription because she needs this med tonight. And I said, absolutely. So we walked over to the pharmacy and she got it, and of course she was still angry. So when she finally got her prescription and she's angry and she's gathering the rest of her property back up, she had a few choice words for me and for the organization, and then she did leave and left the building, presumably got in her car, didn't follow her out, and she left. When I went back to brief her supervisor on it, I noted that she had, in her haste and in her anger, she had left her prescription on the counter. That was she didn't have a cell phone, so we just wanted to get it to her. I remembered how important it was for her daughter. So I was able to obtain her home address, which was about 4 miles away. And I just followed her. Well, I didn't follow her, but she was already at her house, presumably. I went to her house, and I rang the doorbell, and I stepped back, not knowing how she was going to react to my presence at her door after I just asked her to leave ours. And she said, something like, what do you want now, And I just held up the prescription bag and I said, I remember you said this was really important for your daughter to have, so I thought I would drop it off and wish you well. And she clearly didn't know what to say. She was flustered. And I think she kind of mumbled, well, thank you. And I said, absolutely. If we can be of any other help, let us know. And that one always stuck with me because although I was, not pleased to be called what I was called, and the disruption and this whole process with her in the building took longer than it needed to, but we got it resolved. It was a teaching point for me on how to put your own personal anger behind you and aside when somebody's name calling and all that. Officers get that quite often. And use that as a teaching moment for both for myself and for to show that those were the values that we said we had. And by doing it that way, listening to her, giving her options, and then treating her like a person. And I could have said, your daughter's prescription, not my problem. That wasn't what we're about. So that was the story that came to mind when I was asked to think of one that kind of encapsulated some of the values that we talk about in trying to use the great compassionate communication you talk about in my environment.
What a great story. One of the hallmarks of what I teach is that hurting people hurt people. And of course, if you lose a job, you're going to be upset, you're going to be aggravated, and more than anything, scared. And that lashing out, you took that into consideration, but you also didn't take it personally. Nobody likes to be called names, right? Nobody likes to be cursed at and sworn at. But depersonalizing that, to understand that that's coming from someone who is hurting, that is a truly empathetic act. And then to take it a step further, to look past that woman's interactions to understand that the medication wasn't for her, it was for her child. And even if it was for her, I think we can all put our own personal feelings aside for the overall health of another person. Hopefully, I think that's one of the most beautiful stories of compassion that I've heard in a long time.
Yeah, and I've seen that type of reaction live out in many of my staff when they were faced with similar situations. When we have to be the bearers of the bad news and say, for whatever reason, and we try to tie it to clinical reasons and what's the best thing for our patient, we can't have any more visitors tonight, or we can only limit the visitation to this number of people, and we understand that means somebody's disappointed. Oftentimes it's, kind of a shoot the messenger thing where we're the security delivering that. And so, I've seen my officers be called names and be treated terribly, but handle it similarly. And I think that was the kind of culture that we tried to establish, that security is a service department and we have compassion, we have empathy, and that's how we're going to try to live our lives.
And that's what you're doing these days professionally, right? You're consulting with healthcare organizations about how to create those loss prevention departments that are based in compassion and mission, vision, and values of the organization.
Yes, when I have the opportunity as one of my, service lines, if you will, is to go in and do an assessment of a security department. You look at all the mechanical things, if you will. I do. We'll look at, how strong are their policies and are they up to date in terms of what either the law or accreditation standards are, to make sure that they're meeting the needs of those kinds of elements. Do our policies good? Does their training support that? But I also take that opportunity, Marcus, to try and infuse the importance of what you teach and what I've learned over the years, it's really that win-win-win-win, because if we do it, we don't have struggles and we don't have to be physical with people who just, because our first answer is we're going to pick you up and throw you out of here. That doesn't solve anything. People get hurt. There are, justifications you have to come up with. If we can settle something and put our pride behind us, as I said in that particular story, and so I do use that filter as I go in and work with a department to do their assessment. It's on a couple of levels, and I talk about, do you have a mission statement? Do you have a vision statement for your department that supports the overall mission statement? And in that way, I try to I don't know if it's educate or enlighten what a security department really can accomplish if it kind of follows that path and supports what we're here for, and by we I mean all caregivers.
The whole mission, vision, and values of an organization, it seems like all we have to do is try to work towards those things every time. And if we stay aligned, then culture follows. Culture follows.
Absolutely. We have to walk the talk. And when we talk about, you mentioned earlier about the de-escalation, non-escalation, that whole continuum of conflict management. One of the important lessons that I learned that maybe some of your listeners could benefit from is that initially we taught 3 days worth of conflict management to all of our security staff, and it started out with the most basic of non-escalation and de-escalation, and it did get into the point of when push comes to shove and we have to protect a person, could be another patient, could be our colleague. Here's how we do it safely from a physical standpoint. And so there's even the physical element in it, but it's always the last option. One of the things that we learned was that, I think you used a phrase earlier today that you talked about almost like you're going to be the punisher. You're going to call security, and security is going to tell you what to do. And we didn't like that role. And so we embarked on a process where some of the most key departments that had the most conflict, emergency department and behavioral health, for different reasons, because of the patients that they had and the circumstances, would oftentimes not have those concepts that we've been talking about. And so what they would do is they would exacerbate a situation. We had a couple of nurses that, they could tick somebody off in 5 minutes and then they'd call us to be the bad guy. And so we ultimately started training a modified version of that training on conflict management with non-escalation and de-escalation to the clinical staff in certain areas. And we had a hard time getting them to come to the dance at first, but after we've showed them successes with it, where less of their people were being spit on or assaulted or yelled at or cursed at because they got it, and we all were on the same page with how we want to treat patients, because they're human too. They get abused, and we've had a significant rise of violence within the work environment and within healthcare in particular over the last years, and so it hasn't gotten better, and so they become defensive. So it was important to train that, and by the time we started that 5 years before I left, and little by little, rather than have to go out and sell it to another department, we had departments coming to us and says, "Me too. Can we get some of that training? But we don't have 8 hours. We don't have that kind of training time." And so we've developed with our training company different versions. We had an online version, we had a 2-hour version, we had a brown bag lunch version. I think what's important for hospitals to know that you don't have to train everybody to the nth degree. We even developed a version for people that work in call centers, that all of their conflict is over the phone with the yelling and the screaming and the hanging up and the swearing. A version for how they could help non-escalate, de-escalate the person by giving options. And by the time I left, when we started that, and time I retired 5 years later, we had taught, of our 34,000 employees, we had taught some version of that to 17,000 people.
That's incredible to get that
it became
much 50% buy-in across the organization.
Yeah, it became a force multiplier to what we were all trying to accomplish.
Wow, that's a fantastic accomplishment. That's wow. Well, Mike, you've given us a lot of great information today about this area of healthcare and hospital work that I think some of us don't always consider whenever we think about compassion. So thank you for that, and thank you for enlightening myself and hopefully other listeners to this very important work that's done on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, it's been my pleasure, Mark. It was great meeting you in Nebraska and listening to your perspective from the patient, which had just reinforced and provided some new insights as well through your book about how all of us in a healthcare environment can have a role in making sure that every patient has the best experience they can.
Yeah. It's not rocket science, right? It's difficult, maybe a little bit, but it's not rocket science.
It's not rocket science. It can be difficult, but I think that really it does, if it's done correctly, it can be that win-win-win-win thing that we talk about.
So, Mike, in the time that we have left, I usually shoot a couple of rapid fire questions past my guests that are kind of random. Are you up for that?
I am.
All right. So, Mike, let's take. Now, you say you've been in security for pushing 50 years. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So let's go back to the time about the whenever you were getting into the security world, even maybe a little earlier. Let's go back to when you're 16 years old,
Okay.
and it's a typical weekday afternoon after school. You're hanging out with your friends. You're cruising around. You're coming in after practice. What are you and your friends listening to on the radio at that time?
Okay, that was a mixed bag. I in my early college and late high school years, I liked a lot of some of the folk music. I liked Simon. I loved the Beatles. I liked the Stones. I think I was like I am today on music. I was all over the board. The Stones, the Beatles. I liked Simon and Garfunkel. Right, I had every album they made. So that was the late '60s and early '70s. And then I got into college, and I liked some of the other groups like Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Chicago and so then there was a period in my life that I kind of was so busy starting my family and working many, many hours that I kind of almost lost in the 80s. I lost some of the I lost track of music. And when I watch shows like Jeopardy today and they talk about music from the 80s, I go, oh God, was there music in the 80s? I don't remember.
It's
But
so
the
funny
band,
that I graduated high school in '93, and the bands that you're talking about here, I was like, yeah, I was listening to that. Yeah, I was listening to that, 30 years after the release. But so that leads me to another question then. Propose a question that if you were stranded on the proverbial desert island,
okay.
but you could still keep one piece of art with you for pleasure and comfort. What would that piece of art be? Is it an album? Is it a favorite book? Is it a favorite Netflix series or Broadway production? What is a piece of art that really speaks to you?
That's a great question. Yeah, because first of all, I was thinking of art like more traditional, like a
Mhm.
painting or a picture. But then when you start to describe art more broadly, I'd have to say something more interactive. It would probably be an album. Presuming I also got something to play it on, or I wouldn't have been able to do
Of
it. I
course,
guess.
it's a very well
Yeah.
furbished island.
Okay, very well furbished island. Yeah, I think it might have been one of those early albums. It could be, the Beatles' "Let It Be." It could be a Simon and Garfunkel favorite "Bridge Over Troubled Waters" album. Something that would reflect my past as well as give comfort while I was waiting to be rescued.
I think I can't remember which of my books it's in, but I quote a Springsteen lyric where he said, "We learned more from a 3 minute record than we ever learned in school." And like it sounds like with you, I've also gained so much reflection and insight and guidance from um, beautiful lyricists over the last 50 plus years now. So, and then lastly, the question for you that I would have is if you had the biggest billboard on earth sitting on top of the tallest mountain, what is the message that you would want to share with humanity? What's the message that you want humanity to know?
It'd probably be some sort of a combination of what we've been talking about today. And if it had to be brief, it would kind of be learn to listen and be kind. Kind of like understand, the empathy, but you can't be empathetic if you don't understand where that person is coming from. So that listening that you talk about an awful lot in your book um, is so important. And then to have the courage and the awareness that listening isn't enough. You have to then have the ability and the willingness to act on that through some sort of kindness and empathy, empathetic action, I would say.
Yeah, it all comes down to just being human, right? It all
Absolutely,
comes down to
absolutely,
just being human. Well,
absolutely,
Mike,
Marcus.
thank you so much for being with me today. We'll get some links to your websites and such and your contact information if there are organizations out there that could use some of this very, very vital expertise on non-escalation and helping those patients secure the best, most healing and peaceful environment that they can have. So we'll put that out there. Mike, thank you so much for being with me today. And every listener, thank you for also tuning in to this episode of Compassion and Courage. And we will see you next time on the podcast where I teach compassionate communication, provide perspective, and inspire resilience.
Pleasure being with you. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you, Mike.